May 31st, 2019 marks the 200th anniversary of Walt Whitman's birth. He died 72 years later in 1892, and he is, by all accounts, the first representative poet of the American literary tradition. And the word representative is an important word for Whitman because in his entire body of work, he sought to make himself the representative poet, the person who represents every single American. And that becomes apparent from the first lines of his most famous poem, Song of Myself, which begins like this. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Creeds and schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, sufficed at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbor for good or bad, I permit to speak at every hazard, nature without check, with original energy. And so he would go on until publishing what is known as his deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. It was a lifelong effort he made to try to encompass everything that he saw in America and to, as he said, the test of a poet is how the country might absorb the poet in the same way that the poet absorbs his or her country. I should go back a bit and talk a little bit about how he became a poet. His formal schooling ended at the age of 11, and in this respect, he reminds me of the wonderful Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, who finished his schooling at the age of 15. Like Brodsky, Whitman was a complete autodidact, reading widely, reading deeply. He was completely learned in the scientific literature of his day and is famous for having brought into the English poetic tradition a number of words that he lifted from scientific terminology. So he begins at 11 working as a journalist. He works as a teacher, as a printer. By the time of the Civil War, he became a government clerk and spent a considerable amount of time in the hospitals in Washington, D.C., writing letters home for wounded soldiers and dying soldiers, bringing them treats, bearing witness to the suffering on both sides of the Civil War. The proof of a poet, I wanted to say, is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it. And to do that, Whitman begins to absorb his country from early on. In a notebook from the 1940s, he writes, I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the masters and the slaves, entering into both so that both will understand me alike. This is a revolutionary idea, to posit himself as the poet both of the slaves and of the slave masters, understanding the high and the low, the good and the bad, all races, everyone who makes up this country, everyone who can be represented in poetry. My colleague, the wonderful Whitman scholar Ed Folsom, has said that in this country we have our House of Representatives. That's where a lot of the work of Congress takes place, the debates, the votes, etc. And in our literature, we have our House of Representations. Whitman's representations are the first and in many ways the greatest proof of a poet, of an American poet, someone who in one way or another is the poet of democracy. it's fascinating that he comes of age as a poet in the 1850s, in the run-up to the Civil War. For a long time, he's been working as a journalist, setting type in newspapers, writing a novel about temperance, writing all sorts of miscellaneous pieces of writing. He's imagining in his journals that he has a big work inside him. He doesn't know what it will be. Is it a long poem? Is it a play? Is it another novel? And I think that those lines I alluded to a little while ago, I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves, becomes the key insight into the poet, the representative poet that Whitman will become. His world is about to be broken in half. The secession of the Confederate States, which will destroy the Union, is for Whitman not only a political disaster, but in its own way a personal and poetic disaster, because in Song of Myself, he's writing the great hymn to the individual spirit, to democracy, to all the different ways in which a country unfolding across this vast continent might express itself. And then, of course, it all goes to hell with the firing on Fort Sumter and the beginning of the Civil War. Whitman becomes a darker poet after the Civil War, and that is due in large part to the incredible waste of blood and treasure that war occasioned. 800,000 people killed in a country the size of, in the country with the population, the same population as the former Yugoslavia during its wars of succession, about 22 million people. Mind you, in Yugoslavia, about 150,000 people died. Here in the United States, the toll was very much higher. And that's why, in so many ways, Whitman becomes the poet of the great American experiment in liberty, the ways in which that can go well and in the ways in which it can go disastrously wrong. I spoke of Whitman as the poet, the representative poet, and some of the lines that we find and keep in as touchstones for American poetry. He writes, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Those multitudes are all the different people who make up these United States, which after the Civil War became the United States, a country that forged a new kind of union. And in that union, we see Whitman taking his place. He's someone who will tell us, resist much, obey little. He's someone who will tell us in his poems, who touches this touches a man. And in the unfurling of Song of Myself, which takes place over 52 sections, one for each week of the year, if you will, a representative year, he gives us a large embodiment of what it means to be a poet, a man, a slave holder, black or white, man or woman, child or adult. He tells us in one way or another that he has been here since the beginning of time. He seems to have a sense of the ways in which life might have begun with a meteor striking the earth eons and eons ago. And yet, will continue until the very end of time. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you, which is to say we are all in this endeavor together at one time, now and forever, from the beginning of time until the very end of time. That's Walt Whitman, who in 72 years of living managed to make the world anew as a poet, to give us a new way of thinking about what a poem might be, a poem as a form of free verse that would shape the way the world understands itself. There are a number of translations in Russian that you might find interesting. I might draw your attention to Whitman Web, which is a project undertaken by the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, where my colleague Ed Folsom and I explored the Song of Myself in its totality, as well as a number of writings from his time in the Civil War. And In that place, you can find this at iwp.uiowa.edu. You'll see a complete translation of Whitman's Song of Myself, completed by a Russian poet from Uzbekistan, Alina Dadaeva. It's a pretty terrific piece of work. Walt Whitman, resist much, obey little. Thank you.